Welcome to the Sterling McMurrin Lecture on Religion and Culture. My name is Paul Reeve, and I am Professor of History and Simmons Chair of Mormon Studies at the University of Utah. Please take a moment to silence your cell phones and pagers and anything that might beep. With the generous support of Dr. Scott Black, the current director of the Tanner Humanities Center at the University of Utah, tonight's lecture represents the relaunch of the McMurrin Lecture on Religion and Culture. Under Dr. Black's leadership at the Tanner Humanities Center, the goal is to return the lecture series to an annual event and engage the best contemporary thinkers on religion and culture. Sterling McMurrin died in 1996, leaving behind a profound legacy of scholarship and service. Professor McMurrin taught in both the philosophy and history departments at the University of Utah. He served the university as Dean of the College of Letters and Science, Dean of the Graduate School, Academic Vice President, and Provost. Sterling McMurrin also held the position of United States Commissioner of Education under President John F. Kennedy. In his name, the McMurrin Lecture of Religion and Culture was established. Its goal is to provide the best scholarship on religion to our students, faculty, and Utah community. Previous McMurrin lectures have included Krista Tippett, Reza Asland, Thupta Jimpa, Lester Bush, and Darius Aiden Gray. To introduce tonight's McMurrin lecture, please welcome Professor Amy Hoyt.
What a treat to hear from Laurel tonight. Laurel's keynote tonight is A Mormon Woman Has Her Say. Historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich is 300th anniversary professor emerita at Harvard University, where she taught for 23 years. Her most recent book, in 2017, A House Full of Females, Plural Marriage and Women's Rights in Early Mormonism, focused on the 19th century LDS women's rights movement. She is perhaps best known for her 1990 book, A Midwife's Tale, The Life of Martha Ballard, based on her diary, 1785 to 1812, which won the Pulitzer Prize. She has authored other books and articles on women's history and material culture, including 2001's The Age of Homespun, Objects and Stories in the Creation of an American Myth. She is a past president of the American Historical Association and also the Mormon History Association. Ulrich was a co-founder and staff member of Exponent 2, along with Claudia and other women, and her essay, Fictional Sisters, appeared in the 1976 book, Mormon Sisters, Women in Early Utah. Since retiring from teaching at Harvard, she has lived in Philadelphia, where she currently edits the Relief Society newsletter of the Philadelphia Fourth Ward, I love that, and manages a study group called Story Swap. Laurel, her talk tonight is A Mormon Woman Has Her Say, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich.
Thank you. It's been a really wonderful day. We've had, some of you have just come this evening, but just to let you know, we've been here with 24 amazing speakers, all staying right on time and giving us an amazing survey of their experiences, encounters with the life and the work of Claudia Bushman, a much beloved person for us all. And I'm thrilled to be able to add some of my words to the story about Claudia's work. Now, a number of people, let's see, is this first slide up? I guess it is. I changed the title after I sent the official title in, and I'll explain that in just a minute. But I want to begin, as several others did this afternoon, in thinking about Richard Bushman's preface to Claudia's marvelous memoir, I, Claudia, where he admits that even after 70 years, he really hasn't been able to understand the source of Claudia's power And he mentioned, among other things, some of the things that we've heard about today, like 2,500 untrained kids in Radio City Music Hall. But the one I thought was fascinating and really worth highlighting a bit, he asked, how did she work her way through the many layered New York City bureaucracy to gain approval for the erection of a Joseph Smith statue not far from Wall Street on the 200th anniversary of his birth? That is real proselyting, Claudia. Quite amazing. Well, I decided I wanted to change my title a little bit because one of the things that I took upon myself was to talk not about Claudia's impact on Latter-day Saint women, but to think about her in the broader sense as a historian, and to look at her books that didn't focus on Mormon women and her work and her teaching beyond those fields. So we have a much broader context in which to understand her work. And I also poked around quite a bit reading reviews of her books. And her first single-authored book, first monograph, historical work, was called A Good Poor Man's Wife. It was a biography of a woman named Harriet Hanson Robinson, who was known for having written a memoir about her childhood as a worker in the Lowell textile mills in the early 19th century, and then grew up to be a suffragist. It's a very wonderful book, and we'll be talking about that in a bit more detail. But the point here, I read these reviews, and they were very good reviews. She had found a person who had been forgotten, a forgotten woman who played a serious part in the 19th century suffrage movement, development of the club movement in urban Boston. And she had this fascinating history of coming up from an impoverished mother. Father had died, who opens a boarding house to house mill workers in Lowell, Massachusetts in the early industrial period. And I found a review of this book by none other, we're going back in time, Eloise Bell. How many of you remember the fabulous feminist history professor at Brigham Young University? And she wrote a rather long review in which she really took on the question, do women's words matter? Yes, they wrote, but did they really say anything worth preserving and remembering? I mean, we just can't go publishing all of Aunt Millie's diaries, can we? And she sort of sets up that problem. And then, of course, praises Claudia for having taken unprocessed diaries over a very long period and having created such a rich biography. And as she comes to the end of her review, she mentions a really rather interesting thing, that in the preface to that book, Claudia had said when she discovered these diaries, she embraced them and discovered that Harriet Hanson Robinson's writing, quote, had value for me in working out my own destiny. Wow. She praised Claudia, and then she said, Bushman is, among other things, the mother of 10. She gave you 4 additional children. the founder of Exponent, too, a teacher of history and literature, and the editor of a book significant in the history of 20th century Mormon feminism, Mormon Sisters, Women in Early Utah. Now, Bushman has told us how Harriet Robinson did it in the 19th century. Let us hope we don't have to wait for a biographer to tell us how Claudia Bushman did it in the 20s. Well, hooray! Claudia wrote her own fabulous autobiography, and I actually like all of Claudia's books. I really like I, Claudia, and I have a feeling everyone in this room thinks that was truly a triumph. Okay. There is the quote, and there is Claudia. And there is Claudia as she's been introduced to us today. And there is Exponent. And this is this fabulous picture that's in the book that of the 50 years of Exponent. And there's Claudia. Can you see her on the screen? I'm not there. I love this photograph, but I'm not in it. And I'm not in it because after Claudia and Richard arrived in our ward, we overlapped, Claudia and I, for 2 years. And during that 2 years, toward the end of it, we became friends and acquaintances. I'd never met her before. It was a new experience. I really liked her. I admired her, but we weren't really, and we never lived close together after that because I moved to New Hampshire. And it was close enough I could come back occasionally and continue to participate. But one of the advantages of the fact that we didn't live close to each other is we wrote letters that went in envelopes with stamps. And they're archived at BYU. And I maybe should go look and see what's in there. But that was a wonderful period for me to meet her and to find a kind of kindred spirit. We had a lot in common. She's a bit older than me. Her children were a bit older than my children. But I had begun working on a master's degree at Simmons College in Boston. I had been an English major, and I was working on a master's in English. And I discovered that Claudia, too, now had already completed her master's in English at BYU and was now in a graduate program at Boston University, where Richard was a new faculty member. So how did she do it? Well, we've heard a lot about that today, but I think maybe an even more interesting question is, why did she do it? Oops. Boy, this is so tricky. Here we go. There are the kids. And it's very interesting trying to think about that. And in fact, in the memoir, those of you who've read it, she had some very bold faculty members who said, I think, at both BYU and at BU, why do you want to do this? You've got a perfect good life. You've got these children. Why don't you just want to stay with them? And she tells us, it's very, very interesting. I had always wanted to be a mother in Zion. What else could I do with my life? That goal wanted only reaching a certain age and finding an excellent husband, and the future would take care of itself, and I certainly had no other plan. And I was the same way. And in about the same period of time, after maybe the birth of one child, I began to think, maybe I need a plan. Well, I think I confessed one of these letters that was found in the BYU archives a little bit about that. What did it mean to be a mother in Zion and be slightly discombobulated, to feel like nobody, to not know really what you were wanting to do? And in my case, I had read Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique when it came out in 1963. It was a brand new book, and I read it, and it gave me a very interesting insight about the problem that has no name of discontented housewives in the suburbs. And the line that I remembered that just was engraved on my mind, these women are not despondent because they have too much to do. It's because they don't have enough outlet for their intellectual and organizational behaviors. There's nothing wrong. It's a wonderful opportunity to be a mother and to have an excellent husband. Yes, of course. But there are other things that make a person whole. And so Claudia admitted she had a similar problem. She said when she started her master's program at BYU, a friend started at the same time and took the same class with her and got an even higher grade than she did, and then immediately dropped out the next semester, decided it wasn't worth it. And she persisted. Why did she persist? This is how she explains it. I had to do it. I had to have some life of the mind. I had to have some connection to the world outside my kitchen. When I didn't, I confronted the abyss and was marooned in a balloon, disconnected from other people and from ideas in a meaningless kind of chaos. Very interesting, and maybe worth a bit more exploration as we think about that. So, as she tells us so succinctly and in classic Claudia form, 2 kids with 1 degree, each level in her education adds another member to her family. And so she combined these things. Now, as I was thinking about it, I wanted to think a little bit about the economics. What was an excellent husband in the 1960s and 70s to allow a woman to have, who was highly educated, gone to an elite college, had tremendous gifts and talents, and great kids? What did that husband have to have? He had to be able to pay the bills, right? By himself, if somebody was going to spend full time caring for the children. And if she could eke out a little bit of time, 1 hour a week or 2 hours a week, to go to a graduate class, she needed to pay tuition. And BYU came to the rescue because they You had free tuition for wives of faculty. So Richard was not only an excellent husband in all ways, but he had a full-time salaried job and free tuition. And that worked out really well. But once she gets the degree, then what? And she tells us also in her memoir that Richard had a 2-year fellowship at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, and she went with him. And because she had that master's degree, she was able to teach in a small college there a course. It wasn't a full-time job. She was able to teach a course there and contribute in some way. And it was very pleasant, and she loved doing it. She went back to BYU, taught there, got pregnant, was told, "Oh, you're pregnant? Sorry, we cannot hire you." So Richard was really an excellent husband. He won a Bancroft Prize for his first book. He then gets a fellowship at Harvard University for a year, and then an offer for Boston University. And as she admits, I was very glad. I knew there was no more opportunity for me at BYU. So when we think about this in terms of feminism and marriage and babies and being a mother in Zion and raising a family and yet keeping a life of the mind and having a kind of balanced life, I think it's really important to think about the economics of that and what it meant and what our communities offer. In my case, I could have applied to many universities when I was in that situation, when I arrived in Cambridge and had my first child in 1960. And I couldn't have gone full time. And at Harvard, for example, I'd have had to have been full time and committed to a 4-year program. I could have qualified to do that on the basis of my undergraduate work because classmates who weren't as sharp as I was, male classmates, were there. And they were in my ward. And I was babysitting other people's children to help my husband go through a PhD program at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. So as we begin to generalize and talk more broadly about this fabulous story, and it is a fabulous story, it's a Cinderella story when we tell it like this. But it's more than that. It's a story about a remarkable woman who seized whatever opportunity was available for her and multiplied that opportunity into something else. And I kind of think of her, and as I was preparing this talk, I kept thinking about a saying that my older brother attributed to my father. I don't actually remember my father saying this, but it sounds like him, and it sounds like his life, the kind of life that he lived as well. And the saying was, if you can't do what you like what you do. And Claudia has done that. It doesn't, she's been, if you look at this as a lifespan, she's been in 7 or 8 or 9 different places, mostly because of Richard. And in each of those places, she did something remarkable. So let's see if I can get the next slide. I can't really, yeah. Okay, so what does she do? So Claudia now is starting a program at Boston University, a PhD program in American Studies at Boston University. And she goes to the Merrimack Valley Textile Museum and checks out a spinning wheel and learns how to spin. And this is the woman who doesn't want to be caught in endless household chores because she wants to stretch her mind. And I love this. I remember this. I remember when she did it. It was intriguing. This was not tedious work. She didn't have to spin. She didn't have to grow flax, which she did. She didn't have to make cheese and get yenna, find, rennet for the cheese and whatever it is she was doing. This is somebody who is intensely curious about a world that is not her world, a world of the past that she wants to understand, and she wants to understand that world so she can understand the world of Harriet Henson Robinson, who now is in an industrial society. And what is the difference going to be now as we move into industrialization in the 19th century? What will be the impact on an ordinary woman? So Claudia does her dissertation. I do my dissertation. We publish our books a year difference, hers in 81 and me in 82. Do you notice anything interesting about those two books? I still can't believe it. We didn't plan this. We absolutely didn't. But this is what women do when they're escaping housework. And it's we have a good poor man's wife in the 19th century, and we have good wives in the 18th century. And they're very, very different because my book, I'm in a program which specializes in 17th and 18th century history. She's working in the 19th century. We're in different centuries. And there's not, I think I had one page in a woman's handwriting in Good Wives. Where did I get the material about women's lives? The two major sources, other than the poetry of Anne Bradstreet, which framed some of the material, the two major sources were ministerial sermons, particularly funeral sermons about noted women, and court records. And misbehaving in that period could mean breaking the Sabbath. You know, there could be a lot of things. So ordinary women could end up in court records. And then men's diaries and probate records of estates that list objects in people's houses. So I worked with fragments. Claudia had this amazing set of diaries and scrapbooks and wonderful material. And we were both actually looking at a lot of the same questions. How do people who are presumed to be well-behaved live their lives? How do they make space for themselves? How does the patriarchal system operate on the lives of these women? How do they relate to people of other classes or statuses or races in that society? And I love Claudia's book. It's been a long time since I've read it, but I pretty much read it again in the last few weeks, and it's wonderful. It really is. So, to my broader point for today, talking about Claudia's career beyond the material that we've talked about so much this afternoon. Let's take a look at her books. This is the list that she gives at the end of her memoir. And I love the statement she makes at the top. You know, I'm very proud of my life. I've had a great life. I've got a great husband. I've got great kids. I'm proud of my books, even if nobody's ever heard of them. Well, you have now heard of them, every one of them. And believe me, they're all in Harvard's library and probably in the university library, maybe not the proceedings of the first Delaware Congress, but these are good books, books that are read and are used. Now, if my slides work here are the ones that deal primarily with Mormonism. And then, oh, this clicker, I'm going, oh gosh. I've got to see. Okay, this is the one I want you to see. I should have done something different if I'd known I wouldn't have the screen in front of me. So you saw the Mormon books. They're not the majority. If we added the articles and so on, they might be. But what do you notice there in blue? She wrote about Harriet Hanson Robinson twice, at the beginning and at almost the end of her career. 2 books on Harriet Hanson Robinson. And in each of those books, as well as in her memoir, she talks about these materials as being significant to her own life. And so I've been puzzling about that. It's really interesting. In what way were these books significant to her own life? They're different. The first is a biography in the context of Robinson's family, full-length biography. The second one is, I highly recommend it. She was given, in the course of her research, a copy of the 1870 diary that had been in the family, and they gave it to her. One of the descendants, a collateral descendant, gave it to her, and I think gave her 2 or 3 items that had not been in the Schlesinger Library collection. And she just couldn't part with 1870. And she kept it all these years. And then after doing so many wonderful things, she came back and did something very creative with this 1870 diary by grouping, it's a commentary on the diary interspersed with long sections of direct diary entries that are all on one topic. They weren't all together in the original diary, but she lifted them out. So you have the pleasure of following the 1870 war in France as Harriet Hanson Robinson understood it from the newspapers in 1870. And you have an opportunity to see all about her housekeeping in that year, or all about something else, with very interesting commentary along the line. And it has this wonderful title, Going to Boston. So I want to tell you a little bit about Harriet so you'll appreciate. I'm going nuts with this. I should have brought my own computer so I could look at it. There are the two. Sorry. Okay. So I thought I'd put Claudia beside Harriet and have you take a look. Do you see anything interesting there at all? There's Harriet at 18. There's Claudia Lauper at 18. The Lumen Spindle account, which is the account of Harriet's childhood, bristles with the tension she had felt between obedience and rebellion, a tension characteristic of her entire life. Okay, let's see if we can get the next one. So here we are, an excellent husband. So we see Claudia and Richard together, and then I don't have a picture of Harriet with her husband, William Robinson, but what you see there is this love match, Claudia calls it, and he was a fascinating guy and very important in this period in Boston as a kind of rabble-rousing journalist. He wrote columns for a number of newspapers under the name Warrington. He made lots of enemies. He was deep into abolition, free soil. We're talking about leading the 1850s and up into the Civil War period. He was in and out of work. He was an excellent man, totally committed to women's suffrage already. Long before Harriet, he was ahead of her. But he had a hard time supporting the family because he was in this controversial work and he was in this newspaper business. He was a writer. And so she admired him. And what her loyalty to him meant was extreme pressure on making ends meet through lots of relentless work to keep a family together with barely enough money in not the greatest housing. And then something amazing happened. He got an appointment to become, by 1870, he got an appointment to become a clerk or secretary for the Massachusetts House of Representatives, which gave him a pretty decent salary. And it did something else. It allowed them to move out of Concord, which the land of Emerson and Thoreau, which she called a dreary old dead place, into Boston. And they got a house in a suburb that within 15 minutes on this train, the Boston and Maine Railway, she could be in downtown Boston in the center where everything was going on. So the economy picked up, the opportunity for connecting to intellectual life, to go to lectures, to go to concerts, to go and join the newly created Women's Club in Boston, which had a place where you could go and rest and sit during the daytime. She could also go up to the State House, and occasionally, because he knew all the important people, she could meet important people. She became acquainted with Julia Ward Howe and others in the city. She had her strong opinions about them. She began to participate in a lively way. It wasn't going back to school, but it was something very much like that. And yet, this wasn't an unlimited income. And so there's I should probably read this poem because tell you, this was, I think she was very happy about this poem. She saved it, but it's complicated. William wrote to her this little passage, and he said, "You have escaped immortality, being switched off the celestial railroad onto a sidetrack leading to an old coal yard. You shall be paid for it someday, if not hereafter. You shall have a harp for music, or a pencil for painting, or a chisel for sculpture, and I will be your delighted proofreader and critic, and take the money for your golden books." Seriously. He was a booster. He wanted her to achieve. He wanted her to write. Now, Claudia writes, she was not a romantic new woman like those in the novels of Henry James or Edith Wharton, but like these characters, she pushed against society's limits on women, seeking more independent self-fulfillment. She is an older woman with a taste for reform who seeks a perch in a wider society. And she got it. It's interesting to compare the title, Going to Boston, with Claudia's account of her trips to Boston with her 6 kids on Sundays when Richard has the car and he's in meetings all day. Maybe not the most fun thing in the world, but there's fascinating in the book because she tells us all about Boston. Claudia fills in the story, and we understand what Boston was like in that exact period and what the difficulties were. And one of the difficulties that came with this moving up in the world was you had to dress the part. And fortunately, Harriet was a skilled seamstress. She also could employ a seamstress to come and help her with some of the work, but she spent an enormous amount of time, and thanks to her diaries, Claudia is able to tell us exactly how much time. And she's very fixated on achieving elegance on a limited budget. Just fascinating to see how important this was to her and how important the clothes were. Her 2 daughters, she had 2 sons and 2 daughters. Once the oldest son died young, the younger one suffered from asthma for a long time. He was a bit sickly, but she raised 3 children to adulthood. And 2 of the girls had fairly distinguished positions in their lives at various points. One of them helped to create a system of legislative procedure that could be used in volunteer societies like women's clubs, as well as in political settings that were simpler to use than Robert's Rules of Order, if any of you remember that, and had been a kind of assistant to her father when he had his position in the legislature. And the other daughter helped to pioneer the kindergarten movement in the United States. But they did not have easy lives. They too married men who could not keep steady employment. And it's a kind of reminder. I read a very interesting article that built on Claudia's research on Harriet Hanson Robinson, along with research on some other women, like Lydia Maria Child and some other women who are prominent in the 19th century, who had this just serious problem that the men could not sustain them in that kind of work. It was before really salaried white-collar work was available to people who were, not part of the elite. So that's the interesting story, but then there's a kind of wonderful finale that I think you might all enjoy, especially. And here is Harriet as an older woman and Claudia as an older woman. And Harriet was never as respected as she wanted to be. She sometimes would get in squabbles. And you sort of see Claudia reading the story in interesting ways, understanding how a pretty good situation can kind of blow up through interpersonal conflicts. And there was a lot of that in the suffrage movement. But she did write several books, including a history of the Massachusetts Women's Suffrage Association. And she, of course, wrote her book, somewhat romanticized, about Lumen Spindle, about her girlhood in the Lowell factory mill. And Claudia says, as noting that Harriet, she lived till 1911, and the local newspaper reported her death. And Claudia writes, she would have been pleased with the obituary. It was the kind of obituary Harriet would have written herself. She practically did write it herself. The paper drew heavily from accounts that she and her daughter Harriet had already written and published. So she got a good obituary, and as Claudia has long told us, write your own obituary. Okay, I'm going to just very quickly mention some of her other books, but I think these two books are books you would like. They're filled with, they're lively, clean, straightforward, Claudia prose, and they're filled with just wonderful details. And reading the book on housekeeping, I just was exhausted, thinking how a horrible world that was. Having to pull up rag carpets and mend them in the spring cleaning, and all of the maintenance work that she did with a few Irish servants, and they were never good enough for her. And so she did a lot of that work herself, intensely engaged. And you get a whole picture of what that world was like, even among a person who was pretty privileged, white woman in an urban space. Okay, so back to the other books that we haven't talked about, and these are the Delaware-related books and more, and I think I have a close-up so you can see. We've already heard a bit from Richard and Claudia and about the experience in Delaware. The experience in Delaware is kind of sad in some ways from the vantage point of the themes we've been talking about here. Richard was wooed away from Boston University after many years teaching there to go to the University of Delaware to help create, really upgrade and create their fabulous American Studies program, and resulted in a wonderful book of Richard's called The Refinement of America. But there was no spot for Claudia. She was able to teach a bit, but during the Sonia Johnson conflict, which is nationally advertised everywhere, the women's studies program refused to cross-list her course, and because she was Mormon, it became rather difficult. So she had to like what she did. She had to find something else to do and transform it. And she did it in an amazing way. And if you haven't read those chapters, read them, because it is totally an example of a genius at work, starting with a volunteer position as head of a historical society that hadn't yet existed, and ending up as head of the Delaware, what was it called? Heritage Commission, and becoming responsible for this massive celebration of the bicentennial of the American Constitution. Because Delaware was the first state to ratify the Constitution, it was a big deal. And you can read about it, all the fascinating things that she did. And then the job, Columbia University came after Richard. And I think she was excited to go to New York, but she also had to reinvent herself again. And what she did is the favorite title, America Discovers Columbus. That is the book she wrote in New York, which was inspired by the work she had done with that massive bicentennial celebration in Delaware. She began to think about the phenomenon of public history, how doing events in commemoration of a certain historical event can transform a community. And so she dug in and did this just really lovely book about America's discovery of Columbus, which happened just after the American Revolution. Somehow we needed a new identity, not attached to Britain, and began to talk about Columbus and Columbia, and going on to the late 19th century Columbian Exposition. And along the way, she just did a lot of good deeds, like a book on the public library in Wilmington, and then these amazing proceedings of the Delaware Assembly that nobody had gotten around to documenting. And I noticed, I did read the preface to that book, and it acknowledged Serge, Carl, and Margaret Bushman as assisting in the work of collating and indexing those minutes. So she employed her kids. Okay, so the ending then in this list of Claudia's works comes with something that I have a very fond memory of being invited to go to the University of North Carolina for some meeting or some event. And I discovered that Claudia and Richard were there. And they were at the National Humanities Center at University of North Carolina studying farming. Neither one of them ever lived on a farm. It's amazing. I grew up in a farming community. And so I walked in, and there they were with strands of corn shocks and Tabasco, on the bookshelf. And they were ensconced in this wonderful study, just hard at work. And I won't go into all the detail, but the short lesson is Claudia wrote a book on a Virginia farmer at the end of the 18th century because she came across a fabulous set of diaries and account books that she couldn't resist. And it got very good reviews. Nobody much liked this guy. She said she always wanted to marry a farmer, but she sure wouldn't have wanted to marry him. But she wrote this book just out of nowhere. And Richard also wrote a book. He was doing lots of books at the same time, as we all know, and doing a lot of work with Joseph Smith Papers. But he finished his book after a second fellowship, which they shared, which was at the American Antiquarian Society in Massachusetts, in Worcester, Massachusetts. And it was there that she came back to Harriet. And I've already told you how creative that book is and how beautifully set up it is. But it has the enhancement of her having been at the American Antiquarian Society, which has probably the nation's best collection of early and 19th century American periodicals, newspapers, printed works of all kinds. And so that book is illustrated with these wonderful little engravings, one-page engravings all through the book that coordinate with things that Harriet is doing in that 1870 diary. And my favorite one is the one on houseplants, where there must be 100 houseplants in one window niche in this drawing, with the ivy going all the way up both sides and across the top. So when she mentioned, somebody in one of the talks mentioned growing things, there was the image right there that she needed. So I loved reading this, and I loved knowing that there's somebody out there as insane as I am about making long lists of items from diaries and trying to make sense out of them and trying to put them together in a story. It's really fun. If you are that kind of person, there's nothing more fun than digging into those old documents. But I hope that most of you have better sense. But you meet some great people. And Claudia, she's a people person, but she also can really become attached and bring alive and make us care about people long gone. Thank you, Claudia.
So we have some time for questions or comments. And is there anyone who wants to be the roving mic tonight? Oh, thank you. Thank you. You're amazing. Right here.
Just in response to the question of how Claudia did it, I do remember a comment that she made after her baby was had surgery. The light's off.
Like,
Hello. No. I wonder if all these are off. No. Hello. Yeah, they're all off.
hello. Here we are.
Okay, I'll come this way. But right after number 6 was born, and we were involved in some women's activity, and I just remember her mentioning, it's easier after the first 5.
So your talk reminds me of Martha Ballard. Seems like the way you've picked out Claudia's life is very similar to what you did with Martha. So I just said to Susan, it's amazing to watch a Pulitzer Prize prize winner at work. So.
Well, you know, I of course thought about it, and when I saw in her memoir that photograph of her with a spinning wheel, I mean, I'm the one that went on and wrote a whole long book about homespun. I hadn't, you know, I read all of Claudia's books as they came out, except for the Virginia Farmer, and I enjoyed them, and I blurbed a couple of them, actually, really liked them. But I wasn't reading it in the way I was reading them in the last few weeks, which made me so self-conscious. Oh my goodness, it's very similar. It's very similar working with diaries. And it is that caring about little details. Yeah.
I was just thinking about the approach that both you and Claudia have taken of using what was accessible to you in the archives, that you were mothers with lots of children and lots of responsibilities. And so you chose projects that you could really dig into around you. And I just wondered what reflections you have on like using the resources that are there as opposed to chasing projects elsewhere.
I once used the phrase that I had the advantage of disadvantage in my work with Martha Ballard, and even Goodwise. Well, maybe most of it. I mean, I was in New Hampshire. I didn't even have easy access to Harvard. I was in a small state university, and I did a lot of my research in all three of my first books in county courthouses, whatever was close. And I wrote about the place where I lived. I wrote about northern New England, and then got all the way up into Maine when I found the Martha Ballard diaries. So, but there's a lot of serendipity. That doesn't mean you're always going to find something close. I recently had a former student who's now a professor at NYU come and tell me about her absolutely fantastic project. She is working in Spain archives with records, again, working in the colonial period in the Atlantic world of the 18th century, records that nobody's transcribed or digitized or looked at. And that requires travel. And so I would never say, limit yourself if you're able to travel and if you have the languages, and if you're able to do it and apply for grants and so on. But that Martha Ballard book, yeah, it was real serendipity because it's about the only detailed midwife diary in existence for that period. And it's just in Maine, nobody else had found it. It was in the wrong place. Yeah. Yeah.
Mike, but I'm loud. Is that working?
Oh, we need it for the Zoom, but we'll repeat the question. Go ahead.
Comment.
Oh, okay.
You not only had the persistence to go there, but you had a vision. And I'm old enough to know when history was looking at crop reports and taxation records and mail enlistments and things like that. And you were the forefront, you and Sister Bushman were the forefront of the people who saw that the work of hands had value, the work of women had value, the woman's economy, of course, for you, but the intellectual power of the women. You had, and maybe there's, I think there's more. I think there's lived religion as opposed to written religion that goes in that paradigm. But you have the vision to see it and apply it, and you were at the forefront of the history that now we take for granted. And I think especially for younger women here, they don't realize to what a great extent you were doing something new.
Well, thank you. But, I think Claudia and Richard both would agree with me. It was the period of time when historians more broadly were into social history and wanting to know the history of forgotten people. But a lot of it was quantitative. My advisor did quantitative history. And so it was a little bit unusual to come in with an English major, as Claudia and I both were, and wanting to write more literary stories out of that kind of research. Yeah.
I have an appreciation. When I think of that period of American history of the 50s and 60s and the role of American women during that time, Mad Men aside, I think of Sylvia Plath. And if you've read The Bell Jar, I'm sure many of you remember a passage where Esther Greenwood talks about how she is at the base of I think it's a date tree.
Mm-hmm.
And each fruit represents something she wants: family, career, journalism, being a crew champion. All her dreams are represented by these different fruits. And as she is paralyzed with indecision, each fruit starts to rot and fall off the tree. And it struck me that you and Claudia had all the fruit. Maybe at different times,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe they were like at different stages of fermentation.
Mm-hmm.
But both of you were able to achieve all the different fruit in a time where American society was the most conservative in the context of the most conservative and traditional church at the time. So
Yeah.
that is my incredible appreciation of both of your contributions.
Thank you.
Did you have a question, Kathleen? Yeah, right here, Kathleen.
You tell a second wave story, and you lived a second wave story, right?
Mm-hmm.
Did you? Is that fair to say?
Second wave feminist story.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I appreciate that, as these last two comments have made, that this was a wave in the academy in particular, that those of us who followed owe you a great debt. I'd like to turn that to the second wave story inside of Mormonism.
Mm-hmm.
And how we've seen a successive wave to what the Boston women did and are doing, and it's been picked up and has become a tradition.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd wonder if you would like to comment on how you think you'll be remembered in the way that you remembered the first wave. Right? You were writing about, I'm using first wave liberally, of course, with respect to the 18th century, but I think you understand what I'm saying.
20th century.
How are people going to interpret our time through what the Boston women did, particularly the two of you?
Well, I don't know how people in the future are going to interpret it. Right now, it's being interpreted as a terrible disaster to the American nation, and we've got to get rid of all these crazy feminists and reformers who are trying to focus on the forgotten people because it's only, it's pretty dismal right now. Every revolution has its backlash, I guess. I don't know. The people in this room are probably, some of them, I think, are saying, why didn't you fight harder, maybe? Why didn't you fight harder? Why didn't you stand up more? I see people shaking their head. In terms of where we are in the church, I think where we are in the nation right now is everybody is working. I don't even know how to describe this, but I just highly recommend Claudia Golden's amazing book on, what's the title? Career and Family. Yeah, I mean, Claudia Golden was one of a colleague. She and I ran a seminar together one year, very, very brilliant economist who mostly writes very technical, full of math kind of papers, but during COVID wrote a very interesting book. And one of the concepts there is greedy work, where nobody has time with their kids. And we're all at work now, everybody. And she's talking about college-educated women, which is what we've been talking about all day. A very small part of the world's population. But she thinks they're going to, it's almost solved a lot of problems, but now I've created a whole set of new ones. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm sorry, I don't know how much time we have, but after hearing this, Laurel, I'm just so impressed with a couple of things. So if you take the day as a whole, the day hasn't been about this, if you've noticed. The day has been about Claudia's mentorship.
Yes.
All the panels have referenced in some way what Claudia has done for younger generations and for her students and for her mentees. And it's those of us that are surprised by the body of her work. It just reminds us that those of us who love doing history, not necessarily for ambition or the fame, and you happened upon some fame with your work, but I want to just give grace and gratitude to both of you as friends who, like, one of you got a little bit more fame than the other in terms of your academic work, but the other one threw all of that into this incredible love of students and bringing up a body of new generation of scholars. And can we just give that a round of applause that there was space for both of them in that way? And I'm so grateful for that. And it makes me feel a little bit more settled in my own career, being at a teaching university and not being able to do the kind of scholarly work that I've wanted to do. But maybe having more of a Claudia type of legacy. And I'm grateful for both of you as like a yin and yang of that path as a model for all of us. So thank you.
Yeah, well, teaching, but I think the thing about Claudia is the kind of teaching, the kind of niche teaching that, got people at just the right career point and pushed them on, even though it was part-time usually, and she had to work at it to find it, and it just blossomed thanks to the people who responded to that teaching. Yes.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
I've always been so close with you and have listened to you and have known you so well, but I've always thought that I had a completely sort of different path because I was in the international world and I was teaching comparative politics and was more focused on places that were not the United States. And so in doing this book that I've just done, this novel, I really thought it was just a completely different path than anybody has talked about here. But as you asked that last question in terms of what is the next generation doing, I realized that when I was writing this, I wrote this novel because I got sick of people saying things like, oh, people in Uganda are such sweet, simple people. And I'm thinking, what the hell are you talking about? They're just as complicated as you are. You just never ask the right questions. And I got to thinking that in many ways, as I was writing this novel and I was quizzing the women that had gone through all of this, I was asking these same kind of questions, like, you know, like how do you do your washing, and you know, how did you raise your babies, and how did you, when you gave birth in the woods, who helped you, who were your midwives? And I realized that I paid tribute to Claudia this morning for having helped in that Boston group to just make me into a feminist and always ask, what about the women? I don't mean to take so long, but when I was deciding to write this book about these Ugandan women who were abducted and all of that, at first I did this survey to see if anybody else had written a novel about them. And there's none. This is the first novel about those women. I found that there are, I can't remember, somewhere between 20 and 30 books about child soldiers, same war, same situation, but they're boys. And they're written for almost every age group. You can find the second grade version, a fifth grade version, a high school version, and you know, curriculum that go along with all these things, but they're all about the boys. And it was very important for me to tell the girls' stories. And when I was writing the book, I had a panel discussion by Zoom with some of the women that had been my major informants that had, you know, been abducted and had the story similar to the one in the book. And they kept saying, why would any American want to read a book about how we raised our babies? Or how would any American want to read a book about, oh, I asked them about sex. Of course, as you might have noticed this morning, sex is a big thing in my life, and I like to talk about it. So, so I was asking them, and they said, well, yes, we can tell you, but why would anybody want to care about sex and reproduction and how many babies we have? I said, because that's what they care about other people. They care about Americans and all those things. Why wouldn't they care about that for you in northern Uganda? But I'm just seeing that this is sort of part of a quilt here that I hadn't acknowledged until this moment. Yeah. So just saying, even at 83, you can learn a new thing. so thank you again, and I love you.
Thank you so much, Laurel. That was wonderful. Where is Maxine? Beautiful Maxine. We have been well fed today by all of the speakers and especially by Laurel. Thank you for your work and for your tribute to Claudia. That was beautiful. I want to thank Maxine for this wonderful idea that has come together so beautifully. She has worked so hard, and please, let's give her a big round of applause for her hard work.